And we're also very keen to listen to the opening words of the Vice President and Chief Operating Officer of the International Peace Institute, Mr. Adam Lupel.
Thank you. Thank you. Good afternoon to all. I took this sort of as a question, this question of international community and democratic security. And it kind of reminded me, as an old globalization theorist, activist, reminded me some of the early debates that said something like this, that as recognizing the challenges of the 21st century, we all know we need better global governance. But we want democratic governance, and democratic governance tends to be locally rooted. And so we need global governance, we want democratic governance, but we haven't really been able to truly find a way to have democratic global governance. And this creates all kinds of tensions and contradictions and political pathologies, contributing to the rise of populist nationalism, for example, increased resistance to the dominant global order, heightened geopolitical competition, all these things that we're experiencing today, and ultimately a backlash against democratic institutions themselves because they're seen as not being effective or being able to respond to our demands. And all of this has contributed to a marked decline in international peace and security over the last 10 years at least. There is no avoiding it. The state of the world is dire. And this is not just a matter of the most recent tragedies unfolding in Israel-Palestine, we should name it, and Ukraine. The number, intensity, length of conflicts worldwide is at its highest level since before the end of the Cold War. And the international system of collective security, the UN got a lot of bad talk in the last, last session. I'll say a few positive things, but has failed. It has not been able to respond with adequate measures. But this is not only a matter of war and peace. In a host of related issues, it is becoming increasingly common to speak of the current moment as an inflection point in history when decisions will be decisive. Part of this is geopolitical. Part of this is environmental, increasing recognition of the acute nature of the climate crisis. Part of this is technological. We're all obsessed with AI right now. But all of it is historical. That is particular to this moment in time, having just come out of a global pandemic, let's not forget, and the recognition that the structures of global governance today were created during a different time and reflect a different global order. And that recognition has rightly resulted in growing calls for a more inclusive, just, and representative system. That is, here at the World Forum for Democracy, we can say, a more democratic international system, and one that could perhaps better square that circle of the need for global governance and the desire for democracy. The organizer of this panel asked very specifically, given the state of the world, should international organizations be redesigned? And of course the answer is yes, but how? The big how. And International Peace Institute, we're based in New York across from the United Nations, so I'm steeped in those conversations, and it is an evergreen conversation around the United Nations, how to reform the system, how to change the system. Currently around the UN, all the energy is focused around the Summit of the Future and preparations for that, which is happening next September. This will include an action-oriented, outcome-documented, negotiated, that will include a chapter, very specifically, and agreed to be named by member states, Transforming Global Governance. Ambitions are high, realistic expectations are more modest, but I think that ambition should be a message to everybody in this room and civil society and such to push member states to actually comply with that ambition. If efforts to meet that ambition are successful, I would just like to say two things, that two concepts should be front and center. That is multiplicity and universality. We must recognize the context of international affairs has changed. More actors, institutions, governments, and constituencies are engaged at the multilateral level, including youth and civil society, and are pushing for agency in the process of shaping that future global order than ever before. What you see when you look at the multilateral system at a granular level, and IPI has done some of this work with the Institute for Economics and Peace, whose head is over here. you see a field of contestation. And this contestation is often depicted as a competition between East versus West, or between the US and China, Russia and the North Atlantic, but it's much more complicated than that. This is not the whole story. Current geopolitical divisions are significantly more multifaceted, multipolar, to use a word, not just East versus West or China versus the US. Increasingly, one sees a pattern in multilateral negotiations, which will be effect in this summit of the future, of a widening division among a variety of perspective and aspirations and diverse groups of developing countries. We're summarizing this incompletely as the Global South, versus a variety of views, the developed world, summarized under the Global North. And again, we see these cleavages centering around questions of equity and inclusion, in particular around debates about how to reform, redesign newly established international institutions. And you see this in debates about Security Council reform in New York, debates around the pandemic happening in Geneva. We have COP coming up at the end of this month. This is very, very active in debates around COP. And in all of these forums, a multiplicity of voices must be heard. Similarly, it has been widely observed that the call for global solidarity on Ukraine from the US and Western Europe has rung hollow in much of the world, in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. And this skepticism is only being compounded today by perceptions of double standards on international law regarding the war in Israel-Palestine. And this point about double standards is absolutely critical for our future, which brings me to the importance of universality for an international community of democratic security. The Secretary General, who's quite maligned, produced something called the New Agenda for Peace this summer, and it identifies 3 fundamental principles for an effective collective security system: trust, solidarity, and universality. None of those are doing very well right now. Trust is at an all-time low. International solidarity was greatly damaged by the pandemic, and universality is undermined by all the double standards. If we want to build trust and solidarity, universality is the key. There is no trust or solidarity if international rules are applied selectively based upon geopolitical interest rather than universally according to the law. If we want to rebuild our capacity for collective security, we must be morally and practically consistent in the application of international law and norms so that all countries, all peoples feel the system is there for them. Looking at international institutions today, as might have been evident in the last panel, the universal institutions like the United Nations are stagnating. While the wind is in the sails of more partial groups, whether it's the expanded BRICS, the G20, or the like, the question for the future is, does this multipolarity, this multiplicity, lead to fragmentation and disorder, or to a more effective and inclusive democratic decision-making and international solidarity for a democratic collective security? Multipolarity is not just about institutions and interests, but about norms. And those universal norms need to be defended.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you, Adam.